Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our weekly Hebrew word study. Hope you had a blessed Christmas last week with your families. And we're going to jump back into our studies. Again, I always struggle with where to go with these because there are just so many different verses as I read through the week that would just make fascinating studies. But I kind of, corral myself in and say, let's just stay with the path that we're on. And because no matter where you open in God's Word, no matter what passage we look into, it's just amazing. So I hope you catch some of that today as we continue our studies. And you can see on the screen that we are in 1 Samuel chapter 26. And this is, again, the continuing saga of David running from Saul as David increases his power and support, and Saul is on the decrease. And, obviously leading up to the time when David will be crowned king. But there's just fascinating episodes here, and today is one of those. And so, noticing here that this is a time when, as Saul is chasing David, he does have some allies, and one of them are the Ziphites. And so, as we read in 1 Samuel chapter 26, verse 1, there came the Ziphites to Saul at Gibeah, saying, "Is not David hiding in the hill of Hachliah and upon the opposite side of Yeshmeon?" And so, what's interesting here is if you remember, this is a little bit of deja vu because what I want to do now is I'm going to click on my screen and take you back to 1 Samuel chapter 23, verse 19, and listen to how that verse started. And verse 19 says, "Then came the Ziphites to Saul at Gibeah, saying, Is not David hiding in the strongholds of the woods at Hachliah on the south of Jeshimon?" Exactly the same phraseology. The Ziphites, again, telling Saul that David was hiding in the exact same place back in chapter 23 as he is now back in chapter 20 or ahead into chapter 26. So I thought this was somewhat interesting. Who are these guys? Who are the Ziphites? And how did they know David was there? Obviously, David had about 600 men, and these Ziphites were very loyal to Saul. And so we're just going to kind of click on the Ziphites here once, and they were the inhabitants of Ziph. Nothing mysterious there, but looking that they're rarely mentioned in the scriptures. In fact, they're only mentioned here in this episode, chapter 23, chapter 26, and then again in Psalm 54 as David reflects in his Psalms to this episode. So I find it kind of interesting that these people were mentioned. Only these couple times, but yet they played such a strong part in what was happening here. It's almost the exact same setup, and in fact, it causes some of the Bible scholars to think, okay, is this really two separate um, episodes? Is this maybe just a continuation of one from the other? And so they're kind of torn, and of course, they agree that verse 19 of chapter 23 and verse 1 of chapter 26 are almost exactly the same verbiage. But yet, when we look into the story, we're going to see that the episode that transpires and the items that come about are very different, even though in the end they have the same result. And so, very interesting that we're going to go through this. And so, remember, David has 600 men, but what does Saul do? He musters up 3,000 men coming after David. Again, that's what, 5 to 1, or 50 to 1 type of matchup here. Just quite something here that he feels he needs these kind of odds in order to make the battle successful. So it says that they encamped in verse 3, and then gives the location. Again, I find it fascinating that there's so much detail that's given here. And I would trust that if we wanted to do a word study on the names of these cities, the Jeshimon and Hakilah, that there could be something very interesting here. Again, just saying that to kind of pique your interest and show you how deep we can go into God's word. So Saul came after him, and David has his spies. We see in verse 4, saw that Saul was coming, and then what happens is very, very interesting here. And so Saul came, David arose in verse 5, saw where Saul was encamped, and saw that Saul was there with Abner, the son of Ner, which was kind of his chief captain. And of course, there's 3,000 people. This is a huge camp, not easily disguised, not easily hid. Obviously, they had their fortifications, they had their sentinels and security set up, and they were all laid out there, and David and spied upon them. And so here in verse 6, we see that David is there with his men, but he only speaks to two select ones. First one is Ahimelech, the Hittite. Now, Ahimelech is a very interesting name because this is actually a compound word. The Ahi is the word for brother, and Melech is the word for king. So this guy was the king's brother. He was a man of very high rank and importance that had left the Hittite nation, obviously acting as somewhat of a mercenary, a soldier for hire, but yet he was a prominent man, the brother of the king. So again, quite something that he would leave his brother, who is the king of the Hittites, and come and align himself with David. He had to be um, very cognizant of what David um, was doing so that David, had an importance with him and he felt like he was doing God's work in some way. This is very interesting. And so there was another guy there named Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brothers, which was actually kind of his nephew, and said, "Who's going to go down with me into the camp?" Okay, this is David and two other guys saying, "Let's go into this camp of 3,000 people and, you know, look around." This is quite a brave onset here. And of course, we see that um, Ahimelech did not sign up for this campaign. Only Abishai did. And so here it is, two guys, David and Abishai, coming into the camp of 3,000 men. They must have known that something was going on in their favor. They must have had a confidence that God was with them. Why else would you pick two or maybe three guys and you know Ahimelech obviously had no confidence in this mission and said, "I'm not going." And so he bowed out. But Abishai, who was an Israelite, must have felt something in his spirit that God was going to be with him and was encouraged that David also felt this and felt that no matter how many people were there, God was going to protect them and be with them. That is the only reason I can think of why they would even do such a thing like this of two people going into a camp of 3,000. Obviously, out of these 3,000, there are going to be soldiers watching guard. No one's going to be taking a nap break or sleeping, but David and Abishai find much difference. So, verse 7, they came into the camp by night, and there they saw everyone was asleep. I wish I could picture what they've thought of when they came there. And did they hear them all snoring? Were they peeking at them from behind the bushes and see that the guards were asleep on the ground, and they walk up and tiptoe through and they see one person asleep, two people asleep. Everywhere they look, there are people sleeping. Were they snoring loudly? What confidence came upon David and Abishai thinking, okay, well, they're all sleeping. We're just going to walk right in, walk right up to King Saul in the midst of 3,000 men. um, God's presence had to be there, helping them and encouraging them. So they find Saul, and one of the things that's interesting here is he had his King Saul was obviously standing out from amongst the crowd because he had his spear in the ground and it was sticking up in the air. This was a tribal custom along that time frame that the chieftains, the head of the tribes, would always put their spear in the ground in front of their tent, in front of their sleeping quarters, as a sign as to where the leader was. And so David had no trouble finding him, got up, and they must have been totally mystified that all of these men were sound asleep and they could tiptoe through and walk in the midst of this army of 3,000 men, and everyone was asleep. And so they come to Saul. They are getting there, and of course, Abner is there also, and he's sleeping. And Abishai obviously sees the moment and wants to seize the moment, and said, "Hey, let's take advantage of this. I see that God has obviously delivered them into our hand, and that all we got to do is pick up his sword and or pick up his spear." And his verbiage is kind of interesting. He says, "Let me now take this spear and right to the earth one time." He says, "I don't need a second time. I can do it in one fell swoop, and party's over. Kingship is settled. You get to be king. Saul is gone." And David again takes the same position that he did previously when God delivered Saul into his hand and said, "I'm not going to stretch out my hand against God's anointed." And of course, he uses the word Yahweh here, which is signifying the merciful, compassionate aspect of God. And David then goes into a really neat little story here in verse 10 saying, "I'm going to let God fight my battle. Maybe God will strike him this day, or he'll go out to battle and perish." But he says, however God's going to do it, for God forbid, Yahweh forbid that I would stretch out my hand upon God's anointed, and that God would do it when it is his time. Again, what restraint and what a relationship with God David must have had at this time, to just be trusting in such a way. But again, he sees all these wonderful things happening. Here are all these guys conked out asleep, and they're walking in the midst of them. His faith had to be at a very high level. So he says, let's just do something to prove our point. Take his spear, take the jug of water, and let's go. And so they do that. They take it and they leave the camp. Everybody's still asleep. No one knew it, and none of them awoke. And then here we see at the end of verse 12 um, an explanation that David and Abishai must have known, but here we see spelled out for us that fallen upon them was a deep sleep from Yahweh. And of course, this word deep sleep, I have to find out more about it. So we click on that word tardema, and we see, of course, as a deep sleep as it's being translated, not used very often. We see here some interesting stories in Genesis. It's the same type of sleep that was used upon Adam before God took a rib from him. It was the same type of sleep that went upon Abraham before he had his encounter in a smoking furnace and a burning lamp and the horror of a dark night. Here we see the episode in Samuel. We also see it spoken about in Job, a deep sleep, as Job is referencing his condition that he had. And then, of course, in Proverbs, and then once in Isaiah. So it's not used very often. It comes from the root word of radam. We're going to take a quick look at radam and see what it says. And it makes a reference from the um, Arabic, because this is also Semitic language, used to understand that their ears were stopped up, that they were deaf, that they were in such a deep sleep that they couldn't hear anything. And so that's why we can understand that they were not awakened, that it wasn't just a deep sleep of exhaustion. but it was a deep sleep that caused them to not even be able to hear any noises. There wasn't a bird that chirped or a dog that barked that would have wakened them. There wasn't any extraneous sound. David and his men could have tripped over a bunch of tin cans and broken some glass and sounded a trumpet, and they wouldn't have awakened because it was a sleep that stopped up their ears so that they could not hear, which I find is really cool to understand how God works and how God caused this to be. So we're going to end our story there today. What could God be preparing here as if he arranged these type of circumstances? And we'll get into that next week as we pick up in verse 13. So God bless you. Hope you enjoyed this study today, and I hope it inspires you to just study God's word deeper and explore the riches that are hidden within the beauty of the language God has chosen. So God bless you and see you next week. Bye bye.